Frost coated the dead man's boots. Hiram didn't look at the face. He just unbuckled the gun belt, claiming what the mountain had already swallowed. Winter was a hard bastard out here. It didn't care about prayers. It only respected thick wool, sharp flint, and a willingness to stay mean. The high country morning was the kind of cold that stole the breath straight from the lungs. Hiram stood outside his cabin, feeling the familiar, sharp ache in his knuckles as he gripped the frozen handle of his water bucket. Down in the ravine, the creek ran under ice. It made a hollow, choked sound, struggling against the freeze. Water fighting the inevitable weight of winter. Hiram understood the feeling. He broke the surface with the blunt end of his axe, the ice fracturing with a noise like a dry bone snapping in the still air. He filled the bucket, the water dark and agonizingly cold, spilling a little over the rim to instantly freeze on his worn leather boots. This was his world. Up here, a man was only as good as his preparation. Isolation wasn't a punishment. It was a baseline condition. The jagged peaks and endless stands of lodgepole pine didn't harbor malice, but they didn't offer mercy. Either a twisted ankle meant a slow, freezing end. A careless fire meant waking up dead. Hiram lived by a strict economy of movement and emotion. Panic killed faster than a grizzly. He walked back to the cabin. The snow underfoot crunched, dry and powdery, lacking the moisture to pack together. Inside, he tended the stove, feeding it chunks of split hickory he'd cured for over a year. He set the water to boil and sat on the edge of his cot, reaching for his rifle. The weapon was an extension of his own arm by now. He ran an oiled rag over the barrel, feeling the weight of the rifle stock against his shoulder as he brought it up to check the sights. Solid, predictable. It required no conversation, expected no flattery, and did exactly what he maintained it to do. He was out of salt, dangerously low on powder, and his boots were wearing thin at the soles. It was time to go down. The descent into the settlement of Pine Bluff took 2 days of hard walking. The transition from the silent, rarefied air of the peaks to the muddy, loud, and chaotic valley floor always grated on him. By the time he reached the edge of town, his jaw was set, his shoulders rigid under his heavy wool capote. Pine Bluff was a logging and trapping hub, a crude smear of civilization clinging to the edge of the frontier. It smelled of wet sawdust, horse manure, and cheap sulfur matches. To Hiram, the noise was assaultive. Men shouting over the whine of the mill, wagons rattling on deeply rutted tracks, women calling out from porches. Hiram walked down the main thoroughfare, leading his pack mule. He ignored the stares. He knew what he looked like. A massive, unkempt brute carved out of dead wood and old leather. His beard was wild. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a battered felt hat. He carried the scent of wood smoke, old blood, and animal fat. The women of Pine Bluff fell into 2 categories, as far as Hiram could tell. There were the desperate widows, eyes sharp and assessing, sizing him up as a piece of farm machinery, wondering if he could pull a plow or provide meat for their hungry children. Then there were the young, foolish girls, raised on penny dreadfuls shipped in from the East. They saw his scars and his silence and mistook them for romance. They thought a dangerous man was just a misunderstood protector. He stopped at the mercantile, tying his mule to the post. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, A young woman with ribbons in her hair and a manufactured giggle dropped her parasol directly in his path. She looked up at him through lowered lashes, expecting him to stoop, retrieve it, and offer a gallant bow. Hiram stepped over the parasol. He pushed through the heavy wooden door of the mercantile. He had no patience for games. A mountain lion didn't play games before it took your throat. The river didn't play games when it pulled you under do underdines. Why should he tolerate it from people? Inside, he laid his pelts on the counter. Thick, prime winter beaver, fox, and a massive elk hide. The merchant, a balding man named Jebediah, counted out credit. Hiram bought his salt, his lead, a small tin of coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, and heavy canvas for patching his tent. You need any ready-made clothes? Hiram Jebediah asked. Eyeing the massive tear in Hiram's left sleeve, Hiram looked down. 2 days ago, a deadfall branch had snapped under his weight, plunging him down a shale embankment. A jagged piece of rock had caught the heavy wool of his coat, ripping it from elbow to wrist. The cold had been biting at the exposed underlayer ever since. He'd tried to mend it by the fire, but his thick leather needles had snapped, and his hands were too numb for fine thread work. Need it fixed, not replaced. Hiram grunted. The coat was seasoned. It fit him. He didn't want a stiff new garment from a factory back east. Take it down to Esther, Jebediah said, thumbing toward the south end of the street. The seamstress. She does the heavy work. Harnesses, sails, canvas. Don't talk much. You two should get along fine. Hiram shoved his supplies into his canvas sack. He didn't care about getting along. He just wanted his arm warm. The seamstress shop sat off the main drag, a narrow, unpainted timber building squeezed between the blacksmith's forge and a derelict livery stable. It lacked the painted signs and ruffled curtains of the dressmakers closer to the saloon. There was just a flat board nailed above the door. Repairs. Canvas. Leather. Hiram pushed the door open. A small bell, dull and tarnished, clanked flatly. The air inside was thick, but not unpleasant. It smelled of beeswax, oiled canvas, tanned hide, and the sharp, metallic tang of the forge next door. Dust motes hung suspended in the pale light filtering through a single, grime-streaked window. She was sitting at a heavy oak work table, hunched over a massive piece of canvas that looked like a wagon cover. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her stitch, pulling a heavy length of waxed thread through the thick fabric with a sharp, practiced yank. Then she tied it off, snipped the thread with heavy iron shears, and finally raised her eyes. Esther. She wasn't soft. She wore a faded gray wool dress, practical and devoid of lace. Her dark hair was pulled back ruthlessly, pinned tight against her skull. Though a few stray strands had escaped to stick to the sweat on her forehead, she was younger than Hiram, but her eyes held an age that didn't match her face. They were the color of slate. She didn't gasp at his size. She didn't shrink back from his smell. She just looked at him, waiting. Hiram shrugged out of his coat, a difficult maneuver given the tear, and dropped the heavy garment onto the counter between them. The heavy thud rattled her spools. Charleroi, Hiram said. His voice was a low rasp. Underused. Esther stood. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself with a grounded solidity. She approached the counter and ran a hand over the ruined wool. Hiram watched her hands. They weren't the pale, delicate hands of the women by the mercantile. Her knuckles were slightly swollen, the skin rough. He noticed a permanent, deep groove on her index finger, from pushing needles through unforgiving material. Her fingernails were cut painfully short. "It's a bad tear," she said. Her voice was flat, level, no inflection of pity, no feigned shock. "Wool's frayed. I'll have to cut away the ruined edge, back it with canvas, and stitch it down. It won't look pretty." "Don't need pretty," Hiram said. "Need it to hold." "It'll hold," she replied. She grabbed a measuring tape, but instead of walking around the counter, she simply pulled the sleeve toward her, calculating the yardage of canvas she'd need. $2, or equivalent in goods, half up front. Hiram reached into his pouch and dropped a small silver piece on the wood. It spun, then settled flat. Esther picked it up, slipping it into an apron pocket. "Give me 2 hours." Hiram nodded. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He felt strange without the weight of the coat. Vulnerable. He hated the feeling. He glanced back. Esther had already turned away from him, dragging a heavy bolt of waxed canvas off a lower shelf. It was heavy, dead weight. She grunted slightly, her shoulders straining, but she didn't ask for help. Hiram's hand rested on the iron latch of the door. He watched her heave the bolt onto the table. Most women in town would have waited for the man in the room to offer his strength. Some would have manufactured the struggle just to force the interaction. Esther simply dealt with the burden in front of her. He pushed the latch down and stepped out into the freezing mud. He killed the 2 hours in the back corner of the saloon, nursing a single glass of whiskey that he didn't drink. He just let it sit, acting as rent for the chair. The noise of the room irritated him. Men boasting about trapping lines they hadn't run. Prospectors lying about claims. He watched the saloon girls navigate the room, their practiced smiles, their hands lightly touching arms and shoulders. He felt an intense exhaustion just observing the mechanics of it. Everything down here was a performance. When the 2 hours were up, he walked back to the quiet shop. Esther was pressing a heavy iron over the seam when he walked in. The smell of hot wool and singed wax hit him. She set the iron back on the stove and held up the coat. It was exactly as she promised. Ugly. The tear had been bound in dark brown canvas, stitched with thick, white wax thread in a tight, overlapping herringbone pattern. It looked like a scar running up the arm. Hiram took it. He ran his calloused thumb over the stitching. It was tight, impervious. He pulled the coat on. The sleeve was slightly stiffer now, but it felt warmer. The draft was gone. The canvas backing added a rugged durability to the elbow. "Good," he muttered. He dug into his pouch and pulled out a prime winter fox pelt. He laid it on the counter. The fur was thick, luxurious, worth at least $5 on its own. Esther looked at the pelt, then at him. "I said $2 total. That's worth more. Keep it. I don't take charity," she said, her slate eyes narrowing slightly. "Ain't charity," Hiram said, adjusting his collar. "It's payment for doing what you said you'd do." Rentrez. He turned and walked out before she could argue. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to talk. He just wanted to get back up the mountain, But as he stepped out onto the boardwalk, he stopped. The air had changed. The wind, which had been a steady, biting breeze all morning, had died completely. The sky above the pine ridge had turned a bruised, heavy iron gray. The temperature was plummeting, dropping 10 degrees in the span of an hour. The damp smell of the mud had vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and deep frost. Hiram recognized the signs. It wasn't just snow coming. It was a high country front, a whiteout, the kind of storm that buried cabins and froze livestock standing in the fields. It would hit within the hour. He looked toward the trail leading out of town. He could make it to a lower cave he knew, hole up with the mule, and wait it out. It would be miserable, but he'd survive. He looked back at the town. People were starting to notice. The sawmill had shut down. Men were hurrying along the boardwalks. Collars turned up. Hiram stood there, his jaw tight. He should leave. Town was a trap in a storm. But his gaze drifted back toward the narrow alleyway leading to the seamstress shop. He remembered the drafty window, the small cast-iron stove that looked too small to heat a room half that size. He remembered the heavy bolt of canvas she had lifted alone. He cursed softly under his breath. A low, gravelly sound. He grabbed the mule's lead rope, but he didn't head for the trail. He headed for the livery. The first flakes started falling as Hiram secured his mule in a rented stall. They weren't soft, drifting flakes. They were hard, frozen pellets that stung the skin like thrown sand. The wind woke up, howling down the valley corridor, ripping loose shingles off roofs and rattling the heavy barn doors. Hiram paid the stable master a week's worth of silver in advance. Keep him fed. If the roof caves, cut his lead so he has a chance. The stable master, shivering, just nodded, rushing for the warmth of his office. Hiram stepped back out into the street. The town was emptying fast. Doors were slamming shut, heavy wooden shutters being pulled and latched across windows. The gray sky darkened prematurely, mimicking twilight, though it was only mid-afternoon. He walked with purpose toward the south end of the street. He didn't analyze why he was doing it. Analysis was useless out here. You either acted or you froze. When he reached Esther's shop, he didn't go to the front door. He circled around to the back alley. Her small living quarters were attached to the rear of the shop. Against the back wall was a meager pile of firewood, mostly thin pine branches and scraps from the mill, useless for holding a fire through a long, bitter night. Pine burns fast and hot. Then Deese? She needed hardwood. She needed bulk. In the alley, near the blacksmith's rear door, was a massive pile of uncut ash and oak logs, discarded or waiting to be split. Hiram walked over to it. He drew his own axe from the loop on his pack. He didn't ask permission. The blacksmith was likely drunk in the saloon anyway. Hiram set his feet. The snow was blowing horizontally now, stinging his eyes, catching in his wild beard. He hoisted a thick round of oak onto a stump. He brought the axe down. Crack. The sound was sharp, violently clear over the howling wind. The wood split clean in half. Reset. Swung again. The rhythm of it grounded him. The exertion pushed the cold out of his limbs, building a furnace of heat inside his newly repaired coat. He worked for 20 minutes, building a formidable stack of split oak and ash. His breath plumed in the freezing air in heavy, rhythmic clouds. He didn't notice the back door of the shop open until he turned to carry an armful of wood to the porch. Esther stood in the doorway. She had wrapped a heavy wool shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the massive pile of wood he had moved, then up at him. She didn't look frightened by the large man wielding an axe behind her house. She looked confused. And then, guarded. "What are you doing?" she asked over the wind. Hiram walked past her, dumping the heavy load of split oak onto the small covered porch by her door. The wood clattered loudly. "Pine won't last the night," Hiram said, not making eye contact. He turned back for another load. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. Her voice was firm, cutting through the gale. Hiram stopped. He turned slowly, the axe resting by his side. "Didn't ask you to ask. I can't pay for that wood," Esther stated, crossing her arms tightly against the cold. "And I don't owe the blacksmith for it either." "Stola it," Hiram said flatly. "Take it up with him come spring." He went back to the stump, gathered the rest of the split wood, and carried it to her porch. He stacked it with brutal efficiency, building a solid wall of fuel right next to her doorframe, so she wouldn't have to step out into the deep drifts to feed her stove. When he finished, he stood on the dirt. The snow was already an inch deep and accumulating fast. The wind screamed through the narrow alley, pulling at his clothes. "You're going to freeze standing there," Esther said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. "I've slept in worse," Hiram replied. "That's a stupid reason to die in an alley," she countered. She stepped back, leaving the door open. "Come in. Or don't. But I'm shutting this door in 10 seconds. Hiram looked at the dark opening of the doorway. He hated being inside other people's walls. He felt caged, but the wind was slicing through his heavy canvas trousers, and the drop in temperature was alarming even to him. He knocked the snow off his boots against the porch post and stepped inside. She slammed the door shut, dropping a heavy iron bar across it. Instantly, the roar of the storm was muffled, reduced to a heavy, threatening vibration against the timber walls. The back room was small. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, radiating a weak heat. A narrow bed, as a table, and a washstand occupied the rest of the space. It was fiercely neat. No clutter, no decorations, just the necessities of survival. "Put some of that wood in the stove," Esther ordered, walking over to a small tin cupboard. "You brought it. You feed it." Hiram did as told. He opened the iron door of the stove. The fire inside was pitiful, feeding on thin pine splinters. He shoved 3 thick wedges of oak in, adjusting the flue to draw the draft. Within minutes, the metal began to tick and ping as it expanded, throwing a profound, solid heat into the room. Esther handed him a tin cup. It was hot. "Coffee," she said, "or whatever Jebediah passes off as coffee." Hiram took the cup. His massive fingers dwarfed the tin. He took a sip. It was bitter, scalding, and exactly what he needed. "Why'd you stay?" Esther asked, sitting on a sturdy wooden chair opposite the stove. She didn't offer him a seat. She wasn't playing hostess. Didn't like the weather. Hiram grunted, staring into the vents of the stove. "You're a mountain man. You live in the weather. You could have made the tree line before it hit." She watched him closely. Her slate eyes missed nothing. Hiram didn't answer immediately. He took another slow pull of the dark coffee. He looked at her hands again, resting on her lap. The calluses, the grease smudges. Your roof is pitched too flat, Hiram said slowly. Snow loads up heavy on a flat pitch. Wind hits the ridge, creates a vacuum, pulls the shingles. Figured you might need the roof shoved off if it piles too high. It was a practical excuse. It was even true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Esther absorbed the information. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She just gave a single kurtnod. If the roof goes, we go out the front. She said, if the roof goes, I'll brace it. Hiram corrected. They sat in silence. Outside, the storm raged, battering the small wooden building, trying to find a way in. Inside, the fire cracked and popped, chewing through the thick oak. The air grew warm, heavy with the scent of wet wool, coffee, and wood smoke. For the first time in years, sitting in a room with another human being, Hiram didn't feel the immediate urge to leave. He sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out. He kept his silence. Esther kept hers. It was a shared quiet, devoid of the desperate need to fill the empty air with useless words. They were two solitary creatures, hunkered down against the bitter dark, trusting only the fire, the walls, and the unspoken realization that survival was slightly easier when you didn't have to watch your own back. The wind screamed against the siding, but inside, the heavy oak burned bright and long. The fire is burning down to embers, but the night is still young, and this trail stretches further ahead. If you found some truth in this cold country, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who knows the heavy weight of a quiet life. We will keep the coffee hot and the stories going right here. Your company makes the dark a little less lonely. Let us gather around the warm hearth again next time. Midnight came and went without a clock to announce it. The only measurement of time was the steady, mechanical consumption of oak in the belly of the cast-iron stove. Outside, the blizzard had ceased being weather. It had become an occupying force. The wind did not howl. It battered. It threw solid sheets of ice against the timber siding with the concussive force of a heavy fist, trying to find a weak point, trying to strip the heat from the small room. Hiram sat with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out across the scarred floorboards. He was not asleep. He hadn't closed his eyes. Out in the high country, sleeping through a storm like this meant trusting your shelter absolutely. Hiram trusted nothing absolutely. He watched the ceiling. Esther sat in the chair, a heavy wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She was mending a leather harness by the weak light of a single kerosene lantern, the needle punching through the stiff hide with a rhythmic, sharp snick. She didn't complain about the late hour. She didn't seek reassurance. She just worked, maintaining the steady forward momentum of her life, despite the chaos hammering against the walls. Then, the sound changed. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, resonant groan, born from the very bones of the building. Timber has a voice before it breaks. It complains. It stretches. Hiram was on his feet before the groan finished echoing. He didn't say a word. He stood directly under the main crossbeam, spanning the width of the flat ceiling. He stripped off his heavy wool capote, dropping it to the floor, leaving him in his sweat-stained canvas shirt. He placed his bare hand flat against the rough-hewn wood of the joist. Esther stopped stitching. The needle hung halfway through the leather. She didn't ask what was wrong. She looked at the ceiling, then looked at Hiram. "Snow load," Hiram said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It's drifting on the flat pitch, piling up, above them." Another sound cracked through the room. It was sharp, violently sudden, like a rifle shot ringing out in a narrow canyon. A fine dusting of sawdust and dry bark sifted down from the ceiling, landing on the hot surface of the stove with a faint hiss. The main joist had bowed downward, bowing under a pressure it was never meant to hold. "It's going to snap," Esther stated. It was a clinical assessment of a fatal problem. "Needs a stanchion." "Now," Hiram said. His eyes swept the small room, cataloging the meager furniture, calculating mass and load-bearing capacity. The bed frame was too low. The chair was fragile. His gaze locked onto Esther's heavy oak work table against the far wall. It was built from thick, solid timbers, designed to withstand the brutal hammering of heavy canvas work, and riveting. "The table," Hiram said, already moving. Esther didn't hesitate. She didn't mourn the potential loss of her workspace. She threw the blanket off her shoulders and moved to the table, grabbing the stacked bolts of canvas and throwing them to the floor to clear the surface. "The legs are mortised," Esther said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "You can't just pull them off." "I'm not pulling," Hiram said. He reached for his axe, resting by the door. He approached the table, assessing the angle. He needed a post. He needed a wedge. He brought the heavy iron head of the axe down on the tabletop, splitting the thick oak surface with a deafening crack. He swung again, biting deep into the grain. The brutal rhythm filled the small room, a desperate counterbeat to the storm outside. He splintered the top, exposing the heavy, square-cut legs beneath. 2 massive strikes later, he had freed a solid 4-foot length of oak timber. He dragged it to the center of the room, directly under the sagging joist. It was too short to reach the ceiling. "Need a block," Hiram grunted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the drafty cold gripping the edges of the room. "And a wedge. Something hard." Esther was already moving. She dropped to her knees near the stove, pulling out a thick, unsplit round of firewood they hadn't burned yet. It was solid ash, heavy. She rolled it toward him. Then she ran to her tool chest, rummaging frantically before pulling out a heavy iron chisel and a flat, thick piece of scrap iron. "Here," she said, sliding them across the floorboards. Hiram positioned the ash round directly under the fracture in the ceiling beam. He placed the heavy oak table leg vertically on top of the round. It reached within an inch of the sagging joist. Close, but useless without tension. "I have to lift the beam," Hiram said, wiping a mixture of sawdust and sweat from his eyes. "When it goes up, you drive that iron scrap between the top of the post and the ceiling joist. You drive it hard. If it slips, the roof comes down on both of us." Esther knelt on the floor beside the makeshift pillar, the iron chisel in one hand, the scrap metal wedge in the other. She looked up at him. Her slate-gray eyes were wide. taking in the sheer physical impossibility of what he was proposing. The weight of the roof was immense. "Tell me when," she said, no tremor in her voice, just readiness. Hiram squared his stance. He placed his boots shoulder-width apart, finding the most solid planks in the floorboards. He crouched, placing his thick, calloused hands flat against the underside of the ceiling joist, positioning himself right next to the fracture. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs, bracing his core. He pushed. The initial resistance was absolute. It felt like trying to push the mountain itself. The tendons in Hiram's neck bulged, thick and corded. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated exertion. His boots dug into the floorboards, the wood groaning under his shifting weight. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The roof refused to yield. Then, agonizingly, the joist gave a fraction of an inch. A terrible grinding noise echoed through the room as the splintered wood fibers rubbed against each other. "More," Esther urged, her eyes locked on the narrow gap opening above the post. Hiram closed his eyes. He channeled every ounce of strength, forged by years of dragging elk carcasses through deep snow, of felling lodgepole pines, of surviving when he shouldn't have. He drove upward with his legs, his back arching, the canvas of his shirt tearing slightly at the shoulder seam. The gap opened, half an inch, an inch. Now Hiram roared, his voice straining under the crushing weight. Esther slammed the heavy iron scrap into the gap. She didn't tap it. She swung the heavy chisel like a hammer, driving the metal wedge deep between the top of the oak post and the ceiling joist. Sparks flew as iron struck iron. She swung again, burying it flush. "Clear," she shouted. Hiram dropped his arms, immediately collapsing backward. He hit the floor hard, his chest heaving violently, gasping for the thin, hot air near the stove. Above them, the roof settled. The immense weight transferred from the fractured joist down through the iron wedge, into the oak post, down to the ash round, and finally into the floorboards. The floor groaned, but it held. The ceiling was braced. The fatal sag was arrested. For a long minute, the only sound in the room was Hiram's jagged breathing and the muffled roar of the wind outside. He lay on the floor, staring up at the ugly, makeshift stanchion in the middle of the room. It ruined the space. It was a crude, brutale intrusion, but it was holding the sky up. Slowly, his breathing leveled out. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning heavily against the wall. His arms trembled slightly from the massive adrenaline dump. He looked down at his hands. His knuckles were torn, bleeding freely where they had scraped against the rough ceiling wood during the lift. The blood ran down his fingers, bright red against the callous skin, dripping slowly onto his canvas trousers. He didn't care. Pain was just information. It meant the limb was still attached. He reached into his pocket for a dirty rag to bind it. Before he could pull it out, Esther was kneeling beside him. She held a small basin of warm water she had kept on the edge of the stove, and a strip of clean, white cotton. Hiram instinctively pulled his hand back. "It's fine. Leave it. It's bleeding on my floor," Esther said flatly. She didn't wait for permission. She reached out and took his massive wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She pulled his hand over the basin and began washing away the blood and sawdust with a warm, wet cloth. The water stung fiercely. Hiram gritted his teeth, but he didn't pull away again. He sat entirely still, watching her work. She was methodical. She cleaned the torn skin, assessed the depth of the scrapes, and tightly wrapped the clean cotton around his knuckles, tying it off with a sharp, practiced knot. There was no lingering touch, no gentle stroking of the back of his hand. It was a repair job. Flesh instead of canvas. "You ruined my table," she said quietly, her eyes still on his bandaged hand. "Kept your roof," Hiram replied. She finally looked up at him. The harsh lantern light cast deep shadows under her eyes, highlighting the exhaustion she was carefully hiding. "Yes," she said. "You did." She let go of his wrist and stood up, carrying the bloody water to the washstand. She didn't thank him profusely. She didn't call him a hero. She poured a splash of fresh water into the tin coffee pot and set it back on the hottest part of the stove. "We're going to need more coffee," she said. Hiram looked at the sturdy oak post holding back the winter. He felt the tight, clean bandage on his hand. He settled back against the wall, stretching his legs out once more. "Make it strong," he said. The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't fade away gradually. It simply stopped, as if the sky had finally exhausted its ammunition. The sudden absence of the wind's roar was startling. It left a heavy, ringing silence in its wake, a quiet so absolute it felt physical. Hiram woke immediately at the shift in sound. He was still sitting on the floor, his head resting against the rough timber of the wall. The stove had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, fighting a losing battle against the creeping chill. He looked across the room. Esther was asleep in her chair, her head resting on, her arms crossed over her knees, wrapped tightly in the wool blanket. She looked smaller in sleep. The rigid tension of her waking posture finally relaxed. Hiram stood up slowly. His muscles protested, stiff from the cold floor and the brutal exertion of the night before. His bandaged hand throbbed with a dull, steady rhythm. He walked quietly to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed 3 small sticks of kindling into the coals, blowing softly until a flame caught. He added a larger split of oak, ensuring the room would begin to warm before she woke. He moved to the front window. The glass was entirely opaque, coated in an inch-thick layer of solid, crystalline frost on the inside, and buried under who knew how much snow on the outside. He couldn't see the street. He couldn't see the sky. They were entombed. Hiram grabbed his coat, the heavy wool with the ugly, perfect canvas repair on the sleeve. He pulled it on, grabbed his gloves, and picked up the coal shovel sitting by the hearth. He unbarred the heavy front door. It didn't open. The snow was packed tight against the wood. He set his shoulder against the timber and shoved. The door groaned, pushing against a solid wall of white. He shoved harder, digging his boots into the floorboards, applying the same steady, crushing leverage he had used on the ceiling beam. The snow yielded slowly, squeaking in protest as the door cracked open a few inches. Hiram slipped through the gap, stepping out onto the porch. The world was entirely unrecognizable. Pine Bluff had been erased. The rutted mud street was gone, replaced by rolling, sculpted dunes of blinding white snow The drifts reached the eaves of the single-story buildings. The sky above was a piercing, cloudless blue, the sun glaring down with a harsh, unfeeling brightness that burned the eyes. The cold was absolute. It was a still, brittle freeze that froze the moisture inside the nostrils instantly. Hiram went to work. He used the coal shovel to carve a trench from Esther's door to the edge of the street. The snow was dry and powdery, making it difficult to move in large chunks, but he fell into a steady rhythm. Scope, lift, throw. He cleared a path wide enough for a person to walk without dragging their skirts. He didn't clear it out of chivalry. He cleared it because a buried door was a death trap if a fire broke out inside. By the time he reached the street, sweat was freezing to his beard. He looked down the thoroughfare. A few other men were out, digging out doorways, shouting to each other across the white expanse. The town was crippled, but it had survived. Hiram turned toward the livery stable. He waded through waist-deep snow, breaking trail, his massive legs pushing through the drifts with slow, mechanical power. The livery was a mess. The wind had stripped a dozen shingles off the roof, and snow had drifted heavily into the breezeway. The stablemaster was frantically shoveling, looking pale and exhausted. Hiram walked past him without a word and went to the back stalls. His mule was standing patiently, frost coating its long ears, but chewing steadily on a pile of hay. It looked annoyed, but healthy. Hiram ran a hand over the animal's thick neck, checking for shivers. Solid. He turned back toward the main street. He had survived the night. His animal was alive. The storm was over. By all the rules he lived by. It was time to pack his saddlebags, buy the last of his supplies, and break a trail back up the mountain. The high country would be treacherous, deep and prone to avalanches, but it was where he belonged. Down here, the town would soon return to its noisy, desperate mechanics. He wanted no part of it. He started walking toward the mercantile to fetch his coffee and salt. As he trudged past the seamstress shop, he saw that the door was wide open. Esther was standing on the porch, a broom in her hand, sweeping the fine dusting of snow off the floorboards where he had stood. She wore her heavy gray dress and the wool shawl, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She stopped sweeping as he approached. "Trails buried," she said, looking out at the waist-high snow, clogging the valley. "It'll pack down in a few days," Hiram replied, stopping at the edge of the trench he had dug. Wind blew most of the loose powder off the ridges. "It'll be deep. But passable." She nodded once, a sharp, economic motion. She looked at the clear path he had shoveled, then at his bandaged hand resting in his coat pocket. "You're leaving," she stated. "It wasn't a question. Got what I needed," Hiram said. Silence stretched between them, thin and brittle, like the morning air. A woman from the mercantile, bundled in furs, hurried past them in the street, giving Hiram a wide berth and a suspicious glare. The town was waking up. The invisible barrier that the storm had erected around the small shop was dissolving. Hiram shifted his weight. He felt a strange, heavy reluctance in his chest. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He looked at the shop. He looked at the heavy oak stanchion visible through the open doorway. An ugly, permanent reminder of the night before. He reached into his pouch, pulling out 3 heavy silver coins. He walked up the trench and placed them on the porch railing near her hand. Esther frowned, her slate eyes narrowing. I didn't do any work for you. The coat was paid for. That's not for the coat, Hiram said. That's for a new table. She looked at the silver. She didn't touch it. A new table costs a lot more than $3. Hero, it's a down payment, he said. His voice was flat, betraying nothing, but his eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. I need a heavy canvas tarp stitched, double-layered, grommets on the corners. For a lean-to? Esther stared at him. She understood the geometry of a lean-to perfectly. She also understood what he was actually saying. A tarp like that takes time, she said slowly. Needs heavy waxing. Takes 2, maybe 3 weeks to cure properly in this weather. I've got time, Hiram said. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a charming promise. He stood there, a massive, unkempt man, smelling of wood smoke and horse, offering the only thing he knew how to give a practical reason to return. 3 weeks. Esther repeated. The corners of her mouth twitched, just a fraction of an inch, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her. I'll need the exact measurements. I'll bring them, Hiram said. When the pass clears. He turned away from the porch, stepping back into the deep trench. He didn't look back as he walked toward the livery to prepare his mule for the wait. He didn't need to. He knew the shop would be there. He knew she would be there, stitching canvas, surviving the hard winter, and waiting for the ice to thaw. The mountain was silent, and the trail was steep, but for the first time in his life, Hiram didn't mind the thought of eventually coming down.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, The Mountain Man Rejected Every Beauty, then chose the Quiet Seamstress, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the idea of being valued for something deeper than appearance. There's a quiet warmth in a story about someone noticing qualities others might overlook. It reminds me that real connection often grows from character, understanding, and the way two people treat each other. What do you think the mountain man saw in the seamstress that made her different to him? Have you ever felt truly appreciated for something others didn't notice? Maybe this story is a small reminder to look beyond first impressions and pay attention to the quieter qualities in people around us. If it meant something to you, I'd love to read your thoughts below. Feel free to like or subscribe if you'd like more stories from Rugged Heart Man.